All right, so today we're going to break down Kratos' personality using one of the most scientifically validated tools in psychology, the Neo-PI3, which measures the Big Five personality traits, also known as the five-factor model. Although those are technically two different things, they're pretty much the same thing for the purposes of what we're doing here. So part of my goal is to kind of interweave some of these ideas and concepts as I approach Kratos' personality types. Some of that is, well, I think it's just a cool video to make. Another part is I have a bunch of shorts that are coming out that kind of do real quick snippets of specific facets and subfacets of this personality inventory, where I think certain characters in video games, I just highlight those. I also think it's kind of cool because it's related to the game I'm making, right? Because, well, this is the scores and these are the things that people will get at the end of my game. So, the Big Five model organizes personality into five main traits: neuroticism, extraversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Each of these traits is further broken down into facets that capture more specific aspects of a person's personality. This makes it one of the most widely accepted frameworks in psychological research. To measure these traits, we use the Neo-PI3, which is a psychometric tool rooted in decades of scientific research. Unlike tests like the Myers-Briggs, which sort of, puts people in these kind of rigid types, these categories, the Neo-PI3 offers a more nuanced look at personality. It doesn't put you in a box. Instead, it gives you a score, multiple scores on a continuous scale, kind of a spectrum, if you will, so we can see exactly where someone falls on each trait. Also use percentile rankings to understand how Kratos' scores compared to others. Percentiles show where someone falls on a scale of 0 to 100, with higher percentiles meaning they exhibit that trait more strongly than most people. For example, a high percentile anger means Kratos' his experiences with anger are more, he feels them more intensely than, say, the average person. And just to kind of frame this, the percentile rankings are also through the lens and with the understanding of things being on a bell curve with personality. So kind of keep that in mind as you're going throughout this as well. So tests like the Myers-Briggs are popular, but they lack the scientific rigor of the Neo-PI3. The Big Five model has strong support from research showing consistent, reliable results across the diverse populations. So when we look at Kratos' personality, we're using the same tool psychologists use in clinical and research settings. This is what I use when I do, say, the Neo-PI3. That's what's used for hardcore psychological literature. It's used in a clinical sense. Not that there isn't research done on the Myers-Briggs. It's just that usually the de facto and default one is the Big Five or the five-factor model. Part of that is with the five-factor model. Well, it kind of gets deep and complicated, but part of it is how it was scientifically developed, because it's one of the few ideas that does not come from a theory. It is atheoretical in terms of how it was developed, and it's a long kind of story. I'm not really going to get into it. But needless to say, it maps perfectly with the Big Five because, again, they're pretty much the same thing for our purposes. What we can do now is actually dive into Kratos' personality, exploring his unique traits and how they influence his choices and behavior. Let's see. So first up, we have neuroticism. And just so you know, these are really vague percentiles. I can't actually, maybe I could break it down, but it would take a lot of work and effort and money because I could use the Neo-PI3 and try to graft onto that. But it's when you do this thing, it's like a few hundred questions and they're all subjective. So I'm not Kratos, I wish, but I can't answer those questions as if I was him. So it would kind of be like a from my perspective through the video games and stuff. And then you'd have to sit there and map all of it out every single time for every single character I talk about. And then for every single percentile score, and there's a bunch of scoring you'd have to do on the back end. And every time you use those, it costs money because I have to get these things from a publishing company. Anyways, so there's going to be generalities when I'm saying percentile scores, right? So neuroticism, 85th percentile. So neuroticism, it measures emotional instability and how much a person experiences negative emotions. Kratos ranks in the 85th percentile here, which is quite high, but we can break down those into the subfacets because there's for each facet of personality, neuroticism, extraversion, openness, so on and so forth. For each one, there are subfacets that create that whole. But when you specify further, it's really helpful to understand and see those specific things that make up the overall score or facet, because, well, it just adds a level of clarity. So we'll use these as an example so you'll understand what I'm kind of going with. So for neuroticism, you have things like anxiety, anger, depression, self-consciousness, and moderation and vulnerability. So anxiety, probably the 70th percentile. Kratos' anxiety, he rarely shows it outwardly, but he's constantly worried about protecting his son Atreus and is hypervigilant. Anxiety here means a persistent sense of worry or fear, and Kratos is always on edge. Again, maybe not things you might typically think of when you're thinking of anxiety, but it's definitely there when you're seeing like how it's saying, how my script is laid out is that, especially with Atreus, right? Maybe in that domain it's kind of high. Maybe overall it might be lower, right? If we're not considering Atreus in this fact, but if he's given this questionnaire and it's specifically asking about things really related to family members, which would be Atreus, then it would be pretty high. Otherwise, it probably would be much lower, because he doesn't usually seem to be too worried about most things in the later games. I'm using the later two games as kind of framing for this, just because there's, I think, more personality depth to him as a character. For anger, I mean, okay, so we get this one, right? This is a subfacet of neuroticism. Anger, 90th percentile. Very high. I mean, he probably would be even higher. I mean, he has a whole, what is like his ultimate ability, right, is like going to this rage state. I mean, so it's very high. Very, very high. Depression, pretty high too. I mean, when clinically, like, it doesn't just mean feeling sad. It includes feelings of guilt, hopelessness, and self-blame. And Kratos' guilt over his past, particularly his role in his family's death, weighs heavily on him. His other wife, I mean, like the past events and situations, maybe how he maybe feels guilty over certain things related to his. I mean, there's a lot there, right? And so when we're thinking of anxiety and depression on these scores, again, it's not necessarily like good or bad. All of these are on a continuum, a spectrum, neither good nor bad inherently. And it's like, well, wasn't depression always like bad? Well, not necessarily. For instance, if part of the grieving process with someone who's passed away, if part of that is feeling sad and depressed, that's how we go through that process of maybe recontextualizing it, coming to an understanding, what have you. And so neuroticism overall sounds really negative, right? It sounds like, hey, this is not like a good thing. Very loud vehicle out there. Very obnoxious. So it sounds like it's inherently a bad thing. However, well, let me kind of throw an example here. I do psychotherapy. I'm a psychotherapist. It's one of my roles. Helps for me to be a little bit more, and see, that's why like neurotic just sounds bad, but more emotionally aware. That could be a different way to maybe phrase this. What I mean by that is if I don't really pick up on people's anger, anxiety, depression, self-consciousness, et cetera, if I don't pick up on some of these things, it's probably not a very good thing. I need to be very empathetic in that moment. Or a mother who has an infant, a brand new infant to the world, who is completely vulnerable and has no idea about its surroundings. The mom needs to be pretty aware, needs to be pretty observant, needs to be very in tune with their child, because all sorts of things are super dangerous, and you need to know where they are in terms of, okay, are they angry? If they're angry, like, what do I do to fix it? Are they anxious? What do I do to fix it? That's kind of a role there. And it could be a dad too. I'm just using a mom because typically, from what I've understood and what I've been told, is it's a kind of a pretty intense bond, right? So anyways, so back to Kratos. Self-consciousness. I mean, maybe moderately high. When I say 60th percentile, moderately high, it might be like still within a pretty average range of most people. I mean, he's aware of his past actions and their impact. And although he's stoic, he's very much aware of how others, especially Atreus, view him. So again, very specific to context. Maybe most people he's not very self-conscious, but definitely as it relates to his son, right? And moderation, which refers to like difficulty controlling urges, Kratos scores, well, high. This impulsivity often comes through in his battles and his struggle to keep his temper in check. So the moderation's kind of linked again to the anger. Overall, though, maybe you could easily say, well, he doesn't drink excessively, doesn't do this excessively. Well, I mean, in the earlier games, he did some other stuff pretty excessively that we all know, had quick time events surrounding it. So maybe with that in consideration, yeah, moderation might be a little on the higher end. Vulnerability. So this reflects how well he handles stress. And Kratos is at the 75th percentile. He's able to push through tough situations, but there are limits. He feels the pressure intensely, especially when Atreus is involved. Again, prior to this, maybe not so much. In between family dying and having his current son, that score probably would have been a lot lower. Now you could maybe argue that one way or the other because we're not Kratos. We're just kind of taking his actions in the games as kind of the basis and foundation for this. But Clearly with Atreus, I mean, that is such a massive concern for him, especially when they're together. All of his actions, everything, especially in the first game and most of the second game, until later on. I don't want to spoil anything, but kind of makes sense, right? And again, so this is actually something to note: is these scores are pretty stable for most people once they hit around 30 years old. I mean, it's going to be pretty stable unless something pretty chaotic, traumatic happens in one's life, which can easily happen to most people. So there is change, but if given nothing else and no challenging of these things, no like hardcore work on these issues, or maybe not even issues, but these personality traits, you're pretty much going to be pretty stagnant. However, as anyone who knows, in the last game that came out, there's clearly changes in a lot of these, and that's kind of his character growth, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is there's a character growth there. He's overcoming maybe something that was stagnant and maybe dysfunctional in his life. So extraversion, it measures sociability, assertiveness, and energy levels. Kratos ranks in the 30th percentile, which is on the way lower. It's way lower down. And so overall, extraversion score low. And again, not good nor bad. If someone's high in extraversion, some issues could be assertiveness, right? So like if your assertiveness score is kind of like lower, that might be bad in certain situations. If these are all like insanely high and say they're all 99th percentile, this might be more related to like mania, right? Like someone who's like manic is probably going to do a lot of these things at the really high level, which can sound good being like social and stuff, but when you're going out and partying literally every single night, you're going to be probably putting yourself into some bad situations. Friendliness. So these are subfacets of extraversion. They're all beneath. Friendliness. Kratos scores very low in friendliness. If anyone's played the games, you know this. This is just obvious, very understood. He doesn't go out of his way to be warm or inviting. In fact, he often keeps people at a distance. This is seen throughout the game, especially as it relates to Atreus. I mean, he's standoffish from the moment, say, he meets, Thor or something like that. And there's obviously some reasons why he should be like this, right? He's in a very very delicate situation in his past. Traumatic events that have happened in his life kind of has pushed him into this realm. I mean, even being like a Spartan, like even that alone, before the whole godhood thing, right? It's like, okay, if I'm a Spartan, most Spartans are probably not super high in extroversion because of their intense training and stuff like that. Gregariousness. He's also low in gregariousness, meaning he's not someone who seeks out social interaction. He prefers like that solitude, which is typical for introverted personalities. I mean, look at God of War. I think it was 2018 when it came out. I mean, that's the whole start of the game. Like they're very isolated from the entire world. Assertiveness. Interestingly, Kratos scores high in assertiveness at the 80th percentile. This facet measures confidence in expressing oneself, and Kratos certainly isn't afraid to take charge or give commands, especially in battle. So this is kind of where you see this divergence from, if say you just get like the Myers-Briggs and it says, this is your score, this is your little box, this is your niche. Cool, but you lose some of this high-level specificity. So what I mean by that is overall, Kratos' extraversion score is lower. However, a subfacet underneath that for assertiveness is actually really high. And so when you know that about someone, you're like, oh, okay, like think of maybe some sort of, military person who experienced maybe some pretty intense and insane stuff overseas. And you can probably think of this person. I'm sure there's plenty of them, and I know plenty of them that are very nice and friendly and extroverted. But sometimes you're like, okay, like you can think of that individual being like a quote-unquote hard ass, right? So like their extroversion is low, but the assertiveness within that, the subfacet beneath all of this is actually really high. So now you have a really good idea of this person because you have this breakdown, as opposed to just having like one score. And most of the Big Five, I guess, assessments or whatever that you can take online, they're not going to be this in depth. And there's like one I think I've seen that's like, it is super in depth. However, you don't get like the psychologist, or in my case, me, the clinical social worker with a doctoral degree, being able to break those things down and interpret it for you. You'll get the scores and they'll be pretty accurate. So, I mean, it exists online, but it's hundreds of questions. So activity level, this is again underneath extroversion. For activity level, I mean, he's about like in the middle, about 50th percentile, which is balanced because he's active and constantly in motion, but doesn't have excessive energy outside of fighting. I mean, or surviving, I guess, in the case when you see the intro to, the first God of War, the reboot, they're clearly, I mean, like they have to stay active to some level and go out and have some sort of experiences, obviously not with other people, which is where this maybe lands him in that 50th percentile. Excitement seeking. Kratos isn't particularly drawn to excitement. Again, especially in that first God of War game, he like, or the start of the second one, it's like he really wants to stay in his bubble, right? Like he wants to just be like, I want to chill. I don't want to have to go out. I want to like live this life and like raise my kid. However, if this is the fun part, because it's like the player uses Kratos to do things in the world, and there's certain excitement-seeking things that you use Kratos to do. Would he actually do those if, say, it was a book and you were reading the book? Would it say, oh, I'm going to go over here and do this really cool thing. I'm going to go over here and do this really cool thing. That's kind of up for debate, right? We make Kratos do certain things that are very excitement-seeking because, well, it's half of the reason we play a game, right? It's like we're trying to get some excitement. But when we do those things, like go out of our way to explore or fight certain like world bosses, I mean, is it Kratos doing those things, or are we making him? So that's kind of tricky in this one. You can kind of see how this might vary depending on your interpretation. And finally, cheerfulness. Very low, very low at the 10th percentile. Kratos doesn't experience much joy or lightheartedness, fitting his stoic and often somber demeanor. And again, if you play the games, you're well aware of where he lands there. Let's see. So next is openness. This is like kind of openness to experience. And it might help to break down real quick the subfacets. So you're kind of like, oh, okay, that's kind of what openness means. So the subfacets are imagination, artistic interest, emotionality, adventurousness, intellect, and liberalism. So if you kind of think of all those different ideas with openness, this one's kind of more abstract to kind of wrap your head around. But you can kind of, so someone who scores like, let's pretend the 99th percentile, which I am really high in this one. So it's kind of like a self-tell here, is this person's probably going to be like the stereotypical like hipster, like, like bohemian, yuppie, whatever you want to call the person, like who's just going out of their way to experience all sorts of stuff in the world, like going to art galleries, trying to like read intellectual books and listen to, super underground music. Like that's, and I mean, liberalism, like right here is actually, this one's actually kind of mapped onto, politics in a sense. It's not like political necessarily. It's not like trying to say the person's like a Democrat or Republican with the liberalism subfacet, but maybe the person is a little bit more liberal in their ideas of, say, I mean, you can think of whatever topic. I don't really want to get into that, but think of whatever topic you want to, and that person's going to be a little bit more on the liberal side as opposed to conservative. And again, there's neither right nor wrong. I'm not getting into that. This is what it is. So for Kratos, again, it covers imagination, curiosity, appreciation for art. Kratos ranks at the 60th percentile, moderate, but with some interesting facets. So we'll dive into the specifics. Imagination, little on the low side at the 40th percentile. He's practical and grounded, though he's encountered things that challenges his understandings of reality. So, I mean, he kind of has to be imaginative in a sense, whether it's through combat, whether it's trying to approach certain situations, whether it's, well, again, some of that reality bending stuff, he kind of has to be open to this stuff, right? Like, but there's obviously plenty of examples where he's totally blocked off, does not want to like be a part of it. Sometimes it's more because he has to, as opposed to his willingness or desire to want to go do those imaginative things or engage with imagination. So artistic interest, he's moderate in artistic interest, ranking at the 50th percentile. Kratos doesn't actively seek beauty, but he does have certain appreciation for tradition and legacy. There are times, and you can kind of see these in some of the dialogue things that kind of happen in between certain sections or certain characters, where he does comment on, he does kind of mention that. It's in his kind of stoic, gruff kind of expression of it, but he does actually point at those things. If you're kind of paying attention to some of the dialogue, especially between him and, oh my God, I'm forgetting the name, the dude's head, right? That's like sitting there with him the whole time, especially in the second game. Emotionality. Interestingly, I mean, emotionality is pretty high, probably the 70th percentile. He feels deeply, though he struggles to express it. His emotions are present but controlled, right? So he might score really high if he was being really honest with himself. Maybe if he was trying to, again, view things through his specific lens, maybe he wouldn't so much because he's trying to, again, be stoic. Next subfacet, adventurousness. For adventurousness, he's moderate at the 55th percentile. He's willing to explore new worlds if necessary, but it's driven more by duty than curiosity. So again, a lot of the stuff for his openness would probably be lower if he wasn't forced into a lot of these things. Let's see. In intellect, he's also at the 50th percentile. He has practical intelligence, but it's more focused on action than abstract thought. And this doesn't mean he's dumb. Like low intellect does not mean dumb or smart. This is not an intelligence test, which even an intelligence test doesn't really mean that either. It more means like what type of intelligence does he kind of like dedicate himself towards. For instance, like someone could have a high IQ but not really care for super intellectually like grounded kind of activities. For instance, like if you score super high on IQ, that doesn't mean you're going to be like super into like the most deep and detailed classic literature pieces. You know, it's like, okay, if I want to pop open some Dostoevsky, like I'm smart, but I don't really care for that. I can comprehend it, but I don't care for it. That's kind of what it means, right? Next one is liberalism, like kind of what I mentioned before. I mean, he's kind of like right in the middle, maybe 45th percentile, maybe 50th, just like right in the middle. And I think part of that is like he clearly has some things he doesn't care about at all. Like, you know, like, oh, this person's, you know, sexuality, he doesn't care, right? Like that's not important to him, but there's some things that he's pretty conservative about, right? Like tradition and how one should maybe be raised or how one should approach a situation, how one should conceptualize a situation. Clearly he has those, but certain things he's like, yeah, whatever, like do what you want, like your life, man. I think that's evident throughout the game itself. All right, so now we're going to move on to agreeableness. Overall agreeableness would probably be, well, pretty low, 25th percentile. So we're thinking way far back, past the grouping of averages in that bell curve. So the different things that agreeableness is made up of, the subfacets are trust, morality, altruism, cooperation, modesty, and sympathy. Agreeableness overall is a measure of trust, empathy, and cooperation. So the trust subfacet, Kratos scores probably like 30th, so pretty low in trust. He's cautious of others, especially, well, the other gods, given his past betrayals. Morality, Kratos is the 40th percentile. He's honest in his actions, but follows a strict personal code rather than conventional ethics. Altruism, a little bit higher, because interestingly, altruism, I would say, is probably like a 60th percentile. He cares deeply for Atreus and is willing to protect him, showing a softer side. Now, again, just like many of the other ones, which is part of the interesting part of the, you know, the whole God of War reboot, both the first one and Ragnarok, is the fact that, well, that's where you're getting some of this diversity in his personality, right? It is specific to Atreus, but part of that character growth is over the course of the games as he starts to maybe apply some of these outside of Atreus. Clearly, not very much, but he starts to, right? Next one's cooperation. Again, very low, something that he had to learn over the course of those two games. He tends to not work with others very well at all and often just goes for the direct action over diplomacy. Modesty is next, again, pretty low. He doesn't often express humility and is more focused on his mission. And that would probably put that like the maybe 35th percentile. So again, way lower down there. Lastly, sympathy, low at the 30th percentile. He's not outwardly compassionate, but he's not entirely cold, especially with those he cares about. So again, specific usually to Atreus, right? And the ones that, you know, he cared for before who are unfortunately dead. So overall, you can kind of see that not super agreeable person. However, just like any of these other ones, it's not inherently good or bad. There's just situations and scenarios and maybe dealing with certain people. It might not be that good to be super high, super low, right? So an example would be if you're too high in agreeableness and say you work in a pretty intense setting, let's say like maybe in the military, well, it might be pretty helpful to be agreeable as just, you know, I don't know the terms, like a private in the Air Force, right? You want to say yes or no, sir, right? So maybe it's a bad idea or a bad representation. But typically, use a lawyer then as an example. You don't want your lawyer to be super agreeable. You want them to be pretty low in agreeableness. You want them to fight for you. You want them to argue everyone in that courtroom on your behalf, right? You want them to be pretty disagreeable. Now, when they go home and they're trying to, like, you know, connect with their 11-year-old daughter, maybe not so much. Maybe that low disagreeableness is probably not a really good thing. Or they're having issues with their significant other. So again, it's not good nor bad. It's just certain situations, certain scenarios, it can show itself differently. All right, we are almost done. On to the very last one. This is conscientiousness. 85th percentile, so pretty high up there, right? So again, the subfacets, self-efficacy, orderliness, dutifulness, achievement striving, self-discipline, cautiousness. So it's kind of easy when you say those, you kind of get kind of a picture of conscientiousness. It measures like overall self-discipline and organization, things like that. And Kratos is obviously pretty high here, right? So self-efficacy, clearly he relies on himself through most of the games. He trusts himself to handle most of the challenges that come his way. Orderliness, maybe like a little high, but more on the average side. He's disciplined in most of his approaches, although he isn't overly focused on structure outside of battle. Dutifulness, super, super high. And you're talking like 90th percentile here. And dutifulness, he's extremely high at the 90th percentile. His commitment to protecting Atreus and fulfilling his responsibilities is unwavering. And again, mainly in these new games. Some of these would look different over the course of time because, like I mentioned before, certain events, especially traumatic ones, can really shift these things. So obviously, part of this idea of character growth is someone kind of changing and morphing over time. That's what shows, like, well, good writing. Achievement striving. Kratos is also high in achievement striving. He pursues his goals with relentless focus, particularly when they align with his values. Now, obviously, maybe this wouldn't be as representative if, say, maybe his sets of values were completely skewed, but he has some pretty typical Western like values. I mean, he's, the whole Greek foundation and stuff like that. So it kind of makes sense that in terms of what we call achievement striving, here in the United States would kind of line up because of that more Western background. Self-discipline. In self-discipline, he scores, again, really high, 85th percentile, showing remarkable control over his impulses, particularly as he learns to manage like his anger. That might be the one maybe area, right, that he's really not as self-disciplined at, that he's, well, clearly has worked on, though, from first 3 games to last 2 games. Cautiousness, high, but not like as high as the other ones, maybe 75th percentile. He's strategic and doesn't act rashly. He thinks before he fights, ... in most situations, right? Again, we can easily think of times where he gets provoked, in which case that kind of goes out the window, but at that point, most people would be provoked, right? But overall, he's a pretty cautious individual. So, I mean, that's your breakdown right there. You have, let's see, all 5, all the sub-facets that I went through. Hopefully, by me explaining them, it kind of gives you some understanding of what those things mean. Now, like I said, hopefully that helps, especially if you go watch my shorts or maybe other content that I have about some of this stuff, especially the shorts because, well, they're short, and so you might not have a frame of reference, but now hopefully you do through looking at Kratos. Another cool thing is if you want to go follow my game that is in demo at this point, it's just the prologue. I'm working on the rest of it, and the goal is by the end of the game as a whole is the player has a really in-depth background and understanding of their own personality if they roleplay themselves in the game. So it's just a text-based adventure. Might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's a more fun and enjoyable way to do a personality test, because if you do like a really hardcore into the Neo PI3, that thing takes a long time. There's hundreds of questions. So when you package it inside of this text-based adventure, I think it's much more fun and enjoyable. So hopefully you can kind of see that these are the scores you'd be getting at the end of the game. However, just in prologue, so if you want to go check it out, or it's just like in the demo early access, I don't know what you would call it. It's just the prologue piece. I have the other ones all mapped out. I just have to write all the content. So and there's placeholder art and things like that. So just be aware. But all the coding is pretty much done. Like, it's going to track at least the prologue portion of one's personality and some other stuff that I don't really want to talk about here. But so thank you for watching. So that was Kratos' personality, which is a fascinating mix of discipline, anger, and a quiet sense of duty. So let me know which character you'd like me to analyze next if you want to see more like this. Otherwise, they'll just be in my shorts. So thank you and goodbye. So that would be like, can I go back here? No, I can't. I got to select all these. I have a character appearance. It doesn't really impact much, but I just think it's cool to have like a feeling of something like kind of personal, right? As you're doing this, right? Couldn't really go back. That's probably a jump 2 section.